Hello everyone, in this series of tutorials we're going to be learning how to create feathers in Maya using Ornatrix plugin, and we're going to be creating feathers in the most detailed and procedural way that Ornatrix offers. Of course, there are a number of ways to do feathers in Ornatrix. We covered some of those in other tutorials. For example, you could use hair cards with textures, or you could use a completely texture-based approach. But in this case, we are going to be using hair for everything. So we're going to be actually using hairs to create the barbs on the feathers themselves. And later on, we'll create a character that is covered with these feathers. So for the first tutorial in this series, I just wanted to create a single feather that will look realistic and that we can use in later tutorials to create feathers. And for the type of feather, it's always good to use a reference. So ahead of time, if you have a character and you want to go for a specific look, it's always nice to just isolate it and find a single feather that you want to replicate. In my case, I chose this image from the internet. Nothing particularly interesting about this feather, except for it seems to be a pretty standard feather look that you may want, and it also showcases a lot of the effects that you want to have in a feather, such as the little clumps here, some curling, some bending of the hairs towards the tip, and some randomness in specific places, as well as the texture itself. So we will be modeling a more or less procedural feather from scratch in this tutorial, and we will also texture and render it using Arnold render inside Maya. Of course, this is good because Arnold comes built in with Maya, so you can use this render right out of the box. So I'm going to begin by just going and creating a little plane here that we will be placing the base of our feather on. The size of the plane doesn't really matter. I'm just going to make a very simple one with one subdivision in each direction. And I'm going to apply a basic preset, the furball preset, to create some hairs on this plane. We will not need a lot of these operators here, so edit guides we can get rid of, and the hair from guides operator we can change to export guides as hair. And inside the guides from mesh operator, we can just use this option to create a single hair in the middle of our polygon plane here. So as you can see, we have one long hair strand here, and the default unit size, the length of the hair, is 50 centimeters. So this is probably a bit too long for a feather. I'm guessing that the feather we want to create is more like 10 centimeters or even less. So just to have a real nice round number, I'm going to change this to 10. And this will be the shaft of our feather here. The width probably needs to be a bit smaller as well, so let's change it to something like 17 millimeters. Sounds like a good width to have. And the next thing is to add a propagator operator on top of this. So I'm going to go to Ornatrix toolbar here and select this add strand propagation operator option. When I add propagation, you can see right away that on top of our hair, we have generated a whole bunch of other hairs. And this will be our barbs. Inside the propagator operator, if you go to the attribute editor, there's a whole bunch of options here that we will use to define how our feather looks. First is, let's see how the barbs are distributed on our feather. It looks like they're more or less evenly spaced, so we don't really need this random distribution here. You can change this to uniform, and when we do that, we can see that the barbs are now more or less evenly spaced. And let's create a few more barbs. By default, there are 50. Let's change this number to something like 200. And also, on our feather, the barbs don't start right at the base of the feather. There is this part at the bottom which goes inside the skin, so we'll just replicate this part as well. To do this, we can use this parameter called low range, which will push up where the barbs will start, and we'll push it up right about there. And also, we want to change the width of the barbs separately from the width of the shaft. Right now, the width of the barbs inherits the shaft, the width of the shaft, and we want to change this. So let's set the strand group of the resulting hairs to 2. Right now it's 1, so we're going to set it to 2, just so that we can apply a separate change width operator, and we can apply the width in this operator only to group 2. So when we do this, you can see that the base stem of our feather remains the same width as it did before, but now we can separately control the width of our barbs. And let's make them super thin, maybe like 5 millimeters in thickness. And then when we go back to propagation, the next step is to define the width of the feather itself. So we have a parameter set here called length, where you can control the length of the feathers in a global manner. You can also control the randomness of the length. And then you have a curve at the bottom here where you can specify the length of the barbs along the length of our shaft here. So at the top, we don't want them to be so long. We want them to be a bit longer down the middle. And we want this length to be kind of like an oval, almost like an oval shape here. Also, there is a little bit too much randomness here, so let's reduce the randomness in our length. And now we have a little bit more feather-like pattern going on here. So if you go back here, you'll also notice that in nature, the barbs coming off the shaft of the feather usually come off at around 45-degree angle. So we want to mimic this as well. We're going to be using the fanning option here, where you can control how the barbs change their angle relative to the stem. And to make them go upwards, we use a negative value until we hit something like 45 degrees. So somewhere around there. And at the bottom, just like for the length, you have a curve which can specify how much fanning will happen at the bottom versus at the top of the feather. So we want it to be more or less similar values. So we're going to push these values up a little bit. One other thing is that at the very top, we don't really want this V-shape thing happening. Instead, we want them to be kind of like a continuous line here. So we want them to be very short at the very top while still being bent at 45 degrees. To do this, we'll need to play with both the fanning and the length features. So length ramp, let's actually increase the ramp a little bit here and decrease the global value so that we'll have a little bit more control over our ramp values here, and just play around with the points at the top of the ramp. Obviously, we want it to be almost zero length at the top, and we need to add points in such a way that will make it appear more round. So already now we have a much better feather shape. The next thing to add will be this slight bending. You see how the hairs, the barbs of the feather, they don't just go straight, but they bend upwards a little bit, and we need to mimic this bending as well. To do this, we will add a separate operator to do the bending for us. But before I do that, just for housekeeping, I'm going to change this name from change width to maybe barbs width. And at the bottom here, this change width is going to be our shaft width. This is good to have just in the future when we will be adjusting these values again, so you can quickly click and adjust the values that you need instead of having to mess around and guess which ones do what. So now we need to add the curling operator. And by default, it works both on the barbs and on the shaft of our feather. Again, we wanted to just affect the barbs, so we will switch the strand group on which this operator works to value of 2, which is what we assign to our barbs. And right off the bat, we get a little bit of a curling value happening, but right now we have very few segments on our barbs, so this happens very dramatically here. We get our sharp corners. We need to go back to propagation and find this option here, which is vertices per root, and change this from 4 to maybe a value of 10, so it is more smooth. When I change this value, you can see that it's doing too much curling. So what I need to do is I'm going to set this back to 10, and I'm going to go back to our curling operator, and I'm going to mess with the settings in here. First thing I want to do is change the phase value. The phase value determines how many curves that we have in our curling. So phase value is going to be much smaller. So we get a smoother bending effect. And the next thing is I don't want it to curl along the feather plane here. Instead, I just want it to curve on the feather face. So to do this, I'm going to change the axis from Z to X. So now we don't get any curling happening perpendicular to the feather, and all the curling is happening on its face. And I'm going to play with the phase again. Maybe change it to a negative value. and increase the magnitude a little bit more. And I'm also going to change this magnitude ramp here. Right now at the base of each barb, we don't get any curling happening at all. So I'm going to increase this value. In fact, I'm going to set this to full so that we get even bending throughout each barb. And then we're going to change the phase offset value. This value changes the wave, the position of the wave of the curl and where it currently is located on our hairs. So I'm going to just adjust it until we get the look that we want. So next step is to add a little bit of clumping to our feather because we don't get this completely evenly spaced barbs here. Instead, because of the feather's life, some of those may have statically been glued together. Others may have just, maybe there's some substance that is holding them together. So to simulate this, I will add a clump operator. And I'm going to generate a whole bunch of clumps here, just random clumps. And also I want to make sure that we are only applying this to strand group 2, so we don't affect our shaft of the feather. And I'm going to set the clump count to something like 100, create clumps. And I'm going to reduce the number of outliers to 0. We don't want any outliers. Maybe actually a few, won't hurt. So this seems to be a good approximation. And now we can play with this amount ramp in the clump to kind of try to mimic how our reference image looks. So we don't really have complete clumping over the length, more so just at the tips of our feather. So we already have something much better looking, more natural feather looking. And the next question is how to add this kind of frizziness just at the root of our feather. We don't have much frizz going on at the top of the feather, but it gets chaotic at the bottom. My guess is that at the bottom of the feather, these barbs, they touch the animal skin, which causes them to be kind of this fluffy and messed up as opposed to the top of the feather. So obviously to do this, we need to add a frizz operator to our feather, and it is here. And then we need to apply it to just strand group 2, so this applies only to the barbs and not so much to anything else. Then we're going to reduce the amount. But you see, the problem is we have no control over exactly which part of the feather our frizz affects because it spreads evenly. And we need to be able to specify for it not to affect the top of our feather, but just at the base. To do this, we're going to go back to propagation operator, and we have a little option here called add root position channel. If I select this option, a new per strand channel, which is a way of carrying data in Ornatrix from one operator to another. So this a new per strand channel, which means there is only one value per strand, will be added to our output hairs, to our barbs. And the values of this channel are going to be 0 at the bottom of the feather and going to be 1 at the top of the feather. So it's going to go from like black to white. And if I set this, use this channel as the amount channel in our frizz operator, it's called, it's been named by our propagator here. You can see that the frizz is almost, it's not applied at the bottom of the feather, but it's applied a lot at the top of the feather. So what we need to do is we need to reverse this and also to be able to control how much of this happens where. So we just want it to happen a lot at the bottom, and then we want to stop it completely. To accomplish this, we need to add another operator between propagation and frizz, and this operator will be generate strand data operator. And this operator allows us to either generate new per strand data or modify existing per strand data. And what we want to do is to modify the strand data that was generated by our propagation operator here. So the target data channel is going to be our existing channel, and it's going to be our root position propagation channel. When I set this, it overwrites all the values in this channel, so our frizz is again 0, and it overwrites it with constant values of 0. Instead, we are going to use an expression here. So when I use an expression, if I scroll to the bottom, here we can open our expression editor, and type in an expression that we want to use. This uses SE expression, the same as something you would use in XGen. And right now it's a value of 0, but what we want to do is we want to tap into our previous channel values. So if I list here, you can see that we have the SC underscore prop root position. I apologize for the small text here for anybody not using a 4K monitor. This was recorded in 4K, but I hope it's possible to read. So this is just the name of the channel that we exported from our propagation. If I use apply, you can see that it's just outputting the value of this channel. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a widget, and it's going to be a curve widget. And for the curve widget, we're going to feed our channel values to be the value on the curve. So this U value in the curve, which is the position along the curve, is going to be our channel value. And the output is going to be the result of this curve. So I'm just going to set this variable which we created. You can just copy and paste this. I will also paste this in the text version of the tutorial. So we just hit apply. And now we can use this curve to define how much frizz we want at each portion. So at the bottom, we want a lot of frizz. At the top, we want no frizz. And then maybe we want to control to have a lot of frizz at the bottom, and then we want it to kind of just cut off completely. And I'm going to press OK. And I'm going to press apply. And just as we expected, now we have a lot of frizz at the bottom and almost no frizz thereafter. So I'm just going to close this expression editor here. And now we can go back to frizz and play around with how much frizz we want and what kind of frizz we want to have. We can change the scale, we can change the amount, or how much is applied along the strand length. So looking at this feather, it still looks like our barbs are way too thick, especially it's obvious at the bottom here. So what we can do is just change both the width and the count of our barbs. So let's change it from 200 to maybe 400. And whenever you change the count of our barbs, the only thing that needs to be changed in terms of the operator stack that we have here is to go back to our clump operator and regenerate our clumps. So now that we have this, we can modify the barb width. So maybe because we increased by a factor of 2, we can also decrease the width by a factor of 2 to get something like this. Another thing we can do to break out the regularity a little bit is to go back to our propagator operator and just add some randomness to maybe fanning. So you can really randomize the fanning here, or you can make it smaller, and some more randomness to the length operator. So it makes the feather a little bit more realistic because it becomes a little bit more chaotic. So next, let's talk about texturing. Right now, we're just using the default hair shader in Maya. Of course, we want this feather to be textured using a special custom texture. And to do this, first, let's try to render it out. I have my renderer here. I'm going to set it to Arnold. I'm going to render my feather. And initially, there is nothing because we don't have any lights in the scene. Of course, the feather is there. So first things first is let's go and add a light. I'm going to use a sky dome here. So I'm just going to create the sky dome light. And if I render, you can see our feather here. It looks pretty good, except that the texture is not there. Maybe in fact we can increase the thickness of our barbs a little bit, which is going to make it appear a little bit more fuller. And I'm just messing around with the parameters just a little bit more until I get the look that I like. Okay, so when you're ready to do some texturing, it's time to go and assign a new shader to our feather. I'm going to use a new material, and it's going to be a hair material from Arnold. So I'm just going to select this Arnold option here. And in the list, I'm going to select the AI standard hair shader. So now we have this kind of completely black feather. It's using Arnold hair shader. And I'm going to open my hypershade and take a look at this feather texture. And what we want to change is the base color. So for now, let's just try to assign some procedural texture like checkers. And I'm going to select the out color and put it inside the base color here. Inside the viewport, we can use the hardware texturing to preview. Now it's going to turn everything black because we don't really have texture coordinates. So next step is to go to our propagation. So we want to change this value to a flat map value. And to avoid the change in the hair shape here, we're just going to go back to curl and change the noise scale, which depends on the texture coordinates, to 0, so that our texture coordinates don't have any effect on our curl here. I forgot about that earlier. So we go back to propagation. This flat map value will actually generate texture coordinates such that the face of the feather will be like a rectangular UV space. Right now we cannot see anything. The whole thing is black because melanin in the hair shader is blocking our texture. So I'm just going to go and decrease the melanin here. And once you decrease the melanin value, you can see more of the texture in our shader. So if we look at our hair, you can see that our feather is now properly textured using this procedural checker texture here. So if I go back to our render and re-render the hair, you see how the render now reflects the checker texture. So the next thing to do is to replace this texture with an actual feather that we manually paint inside a painting application. So first things first is we need to generate a file or a space where we can visualize our feather with its barbs. And to do this, we're going to use a mesh from strands operator, which is located at the top of our stack here. It's going to convert our feather hair structure to an actual mesh within Maya. And this is very useful because we can use UV tools inside Maya. As you see, it did not convert our texture coordinates completely. And to do this, we just need to go and change this option for mapping type from the 1 UV at each vertex to a direct inherit texture coordinates from hair option. When I do this, our feather texture is back. And now I can select my furball shape in the operator stack, and inside UV menu in Maya, go to the UV editor and visualize our feather texture coordinates. So we just need to grab a screen image of this. I'm going to use the Alt Print Screen combo in Windows to just grab a screenshot of this. And then I'm going to open my favorite image editor, and I'm just going to paste it here. Inside our image editor, we want to crop just the UV space without the window itself. So I'm going to approximately grab our UV window here. So what we have in our image will be UV coordinates going from 0 to 1 in both the X and the Y directions. And I'm going to crop my image like this. And I'm going to use this as a guide for painting my feather. So if we wanted to replicate the feather in our image, you see that it starts out as kind of white here and goes a little bit more brown on one side, a little bit darker in different spots. It goes almost red, more like ginger color on the right side. And then again, it has darker and lighter spots throughout. I'm not a great painting artist, but I'm just going to use basic brushes inside Affinity Painter here to paint these values in. So again, this is just a quick job for me, and while it's probably not going to duplicate the look of this feather completely, you get the idea about how to paint this the feather texture once you have the layout of the actual feather in your UV space inside the image editor. So now that I've painted my feather here, I'm going to go and export this image to just a JPEG file. You can probably use a non-lossy format, which is a bit better, but I'm using JPEG for now. I'm just gonna name my texture feather texture, save it, and back in Maya, I don't need this anymore. I can turn off the mesh from strands operator. So inside the viewport, we again see the feather mesh represented as hairs. And back in Hypershade, I'm going to add a file node. Inside the file node, I'm going to select my newly painted feather image. And I'm going to connect this file node, its color, instead of our checker, into the base color of the standard hair shader. So now that we did that, we have our feather textured inside the viewport using our newly painted bitmap. And if I go back and renders this out, it's probably a little bit too much light, but now we have some custom well-placed bitmap texture on top of our feather. So this more or less covers the necessary basics that we will need to populate our character with feathers. And now that we have this single feather with its set of operators that control its shape and appearance, we can use this knowledge to create all kinds of feather shapes with all kinds of textures and styles. And we can also randomize these parameters or modify them to make unique looking feathers and create a feather palette, something that we will be doing in a future tutorial when we will place these feathers on top of an actual character. So stay tuned for that. And for now, feel free to download the sample file from this tutorial on our website. See you soon in the next tutorial.